played a role in creating such environments, he was often at the heart of such interdisciplinary endeavors, forging links between researchers and artists, students and faculty, and also raising questions to push the limits of both artistic and empirical inquiry, demonstrating a unique ability to talk across disciplines, a passion for hands-on education, and a commitment to engaging students as collaborators in the research process. And so it's perhaps not surprising that he's also received awards for his teaching, including a Penn State Graduate Faculty Teaching Award. I could say much more, but let's for now welcome Nilàm.
Thank you, David. It's a real pleasure to see you again. I suddenly got quite nervous, and he's going to give the introduction here. Maybe it's because he remembers all of this space that we had, and creating such a space with artists and engineers and computer scientists and social scientists sitting in there. You never know what's happening. It's like complete chaos all the time. And then these beautiful things pop up every once in a while. So it was nice to remember that. Thank you. Pleasure to be here with you all. I'm excited to talk about some of the work it is that we're doing. I have about 168 slides. Hopefully some of them are hidden. I'm not quite sure how many of them are or if enough of them are, but we'll try to get through a variety of different things here. First, I want to thank the funding agencies, the institutions, and all of the people who have contributed to this work. I'm giving you this talk, but much of the work is being done by wonderful sets of students and postdocs. And I have a long list of collaborators, and it keeps getting longer and longer and longer. And the font size gets smaller and smaller and smaller. So it's going to be the opposite of what I want to be happening, is that they are much more of the work is than I am these days. But thank you to all these people and the funding agencies. Also, in the spirit of the interdisciplinariness of this group, also thought I'd try to challenge myself and you all a little bit with saying, where are we deriving our inspirations from? So in addition to all the people who I have the pleasure to work with, there are artists out there who are doing interesting things that you come across every once in a while, and you say, how does this change the way in which I think about my problems? So here's a piece by Richard Serra. It's a 12-foot tall steel wall that's in the midst of this space. And the reason that he's creating this type of work is that as soon as you go into that space, it changes the way in which you orient to the space. What you see, what you can't see, how it is that you move through the space is different because that big thing is there. And I'm going to try to get to social media, which is why many of you are here, is Screenomics. This is pictures that have been taken of a person's phone every 5 seconds. And I'll show you later, we've done this for an entire year for some people. And this is changing how it is that we orient to the world, how it is that we move through the world, and all the different ways in which we interact with the world. So any behavior that you can imagine is represented here: interpersonal relations, engagement with different types of context, content, information search. How is it that algorithms are sending stuff to us? So this is a very rich piece of context. As David said, I've always been interested in this interplay between the person and the context. And this, in a sense, is very literally the screen, the membrane which sits between us and context. And that's why it became interesting. Okay, and we'll come back to that later. A little shout out here to the bottom. That's like deriving inspiration from genomics and the visualizations that are used there. How can we port them over into this space as well? Okay, 3 big ideas that I sort of want to try to get through. One is to introduce you to change processes and the way that I think about change. That's sort of just the basic foundation of the perspective, which is I'm approaching the work from. Dynamic, developmental, and digital systems. Talk about 3 different types of change processes. Then I'll go into a thing which I'm calling now zoots, zooms, tensions, and switches, ways of approaching the analysis or designing the data in order to be able to look at particular kinds of phenomenon. And then we'll get into this Screenomics portion here, which is about digital life and complexity. And we gathered those data, and now we're trying to figure out what to do with them. And it's a much bigger problem than we thought when we went into the space, so we'll try to get there as well. Okay, so what is it that I do? And my group is trying to study and invoke biopsychosocial cultural change to indicate that we're trying to work across all different levels. So I was trained as a quantitative psychologist within a psychology department, and then I ended up in a program on human development, working next to biologists as well as cultural scientists. And so trying to span that whole entire range. It's changing at every level. So the methods we were developing to look at change could be applied to all of these different levels. And I sort of locate myself here at the interface between theory and method. How is it that we're trying to make the translation between the methods that we use and the particular theories? Just a couple of the types of techniques that we're using. LLMs are coming in now, of course. We're all trying to figure out how to make sense of them and how to use them for good. And so we're trying to do that as well. And there's this intensive longitudinal data. So new data streams come along. They require us to approach things with different methods, and hopefully those in turn change the theoretical perspectives that we're bringing. So it's not the case that theory is always driving the whole process here, but also method can drive the process and data can drive the process as well. Okay, so we sort of forwarded a taxonomy of different kinds of change processes and came up with 4 types of processes. So if you think about the phenomena that you're interested in, my hope is that it can fit into one of these 4 different types of buckets. So is your process a incremental change process? Is your process of interest a transformational change process that's going to make a distinct change between qualitative states? Or is it a stochastic process that's characterized by randomness? And how is it that the randomness floats by? So this is qualitative distinctions between different kinds of change processes. But you've also noted that I've written each one of them as a differential equation form underneath that. So they're not actually qualitative differences necessarily. There can also be translated into the same mathematical format. This blew my mind when I finally wrote that out. It's like, oh, wait a second. Great taxonomy isn't quite as clean as we hoped that it would be. And it even gets worse than that, is that some processes don't fit neatly into one or the other. They might be characterized by multiple types of these. So it becomes quite messy quite quickly, but we'll try to engage with it from this perspective for a bit anyway. Okay, so to give some examples, so here's an incremental change process. This is the growth in physical height of individuals from age 3 to age 19 along the x-axis. And we can see that it's characterized by nonlinear shape. So we're all growing towards an asymptote in our height. Some of us reach it sooner than others. I met someone earlier this morning who I'd only ever met before on Zoom, and I was suddenly remembered how short I am compared to them. And that live meeting is different than it is in the Zoom world there. Okay, so here's a process which is going through. It's always going upwards until the very end of life, and then it might come down a little bit. And we can construct a nonlinear equation in order to describe the change which is occurring and to highlight particular points in that change process that are of interest. For instance, where are the growth spurts going to be located in? Okay, another one is a transformational change process. So we have a line of work on terminal decline. This is the cognitive and physical declines that occur prior to the end of life. And we can see here by engaging with this transformational part of the change is that there's sort of regular age-related change, and then there's this terminal piece, which is much steeper, that comes in the last part. And we can see that allowing that change point to differ across people, some people might enter into the terminal phase 10 years prior to death. Some people might enter 5 years prior to death, some 2 years prior to death, and some might not ever enter it at all, presumably because they died of an accident rather than of this particular kind of disease process. So now we have a way in which we can engage from the data and where is the change point when it exists. One difficulty to this, you notice I've been highlighting up there the number of observations that are needed in order to engage with these types of theories. So already when you get longitudinal data, you have more other types of theories that or phenomena that you can engage with because you have this process. Now, this one requires at least 12 occasions in order to be able to identify where those change points are. So the get more data, the more flexible it can become. Okay, so that's incremental and transformational change process. We can look at stability maintenance processes. And here I've changed the time scale completely. So before we were sort of working on years, and now this is 12 minutes of time as people are being exposed, as children are being exposed to emotion-inducing films that have been borrowed from Disney. So this is The Lion King. So there's a portion of the film which is sort of a fear induction, a portion which is a sad induction, happy, etc. And this is a measure of RSA, respiratory sinus arrhythmia, which is a measure of the sort of parasympathetic activity. And we can see that there is engagement, as shown by the decreases there, at different times during this film, with a return back to equilibrium after the film is ending. So these are short 2.5-minute film clips. And you can see Disney's so good at its job that it like creates a climax here in the fear film, and it releases you and lets you go back towards your equilibrium. And it doesn't let you go too far so that you sort of freak out too much there, but it sort of goes just enough, and then it brings you back. And we can also look here to see inter-individual differences in the reactivity of different children to this type of film clip. My interest is in nonlinear growth modeling, so I was very curious on how is it that we get these shapes out that are going here. I also want to highlight, so here's that film clip itself. And notice that in a typical experimental design, we often treat it as stimulus on versus stimulus off, the sort of block design that's depicted on the left here, when in reality, that stimulus is quite dynamic, and the way in which it is creating the physiological reactivity to it is in a very dynamic way. So now you've got this cute little nonlinear shape in there of the independent variable that then we can use in the prediction piece there. What is it in the content of the video that is driving the reactivity to that? And in that interdisciplinary fashion, this curve is what it is that we got out of these particular data. And that's what Richard Serra used to make his piece. Not really, not actually, but you see the parallels there on how it is that these beautiful nonlinear shapes are also embedded in our data places when we go and look for them. So we can try to do different occasions as well. Okay, so we've got time series models, we've got growth models. We can try to use those in order to articulate particular types of change processes. And then I'm a proponent of trying to name those change processes. So rigidity, flexibility, reactivity, you notice these sort of ITY type names I put into this type of process outcome. And other names that often end in TION, regulation, activation, exploration, et cetera, would be on the right-hand side. So sort of a rule of thumb that one can use, like what method should I use, or what kind of change process am I after, if the words which I use to describe that change process have these particular endings to them. It's not perfect, but at least I'm trying to like force the idea of let's name the parameters so that we give them psychological meaning, as opposed to just calling them intercept and slope, for instance. Okay, I want to give a shout out to David here, who has taken our 4-part taxonomy and also extended it in a variety of ways in order to create here now 9 different types of processes, and that you would engage different methods for each one of these different types of processes. So student is now moved beyond what it is that we were doing. Thank you, David. Okay, so that just gives you the background on sort of where my approach is, how it is that I'm thinking about change, how I'm thinking about interdisciplinariness in some senses, and now sort of get into some ways in which we're trying to use those change processes to articulate those change processes in different ways. So zooms, tensions, and switches. And this is sort of purposefully named after Zoots, which is reference to the Zoot suit, which was an invocation of rebellion in the 1930s. So I'm trying to like also get that in here as well at the same time. So zooms, tensions, and switches, and we'll talk about each one of these in turn. Okay, so zooms. So those 4 different kinds of change processes can manifest at different time scales. And when we can combine them together, and particularly as a developmentalist, like the long-term change process has implications of how the short-term process unfolds. So emotion regulation is a different kind of process when I'm very young compared to when I get older. Then the content of that emotion regulation process, the way in which it manifests, might change over time. So we've got long-term change in the short-term change. Analytically, that's a lot harder than it sounds, especially to get the data that we need in order to be able to articulate these multiple levels of analysis here. So about a decade, almost 15 years ago now, we were among the first groups who started collecting data via smartphone. And at that time, you had to give people smartphones. People just didn't have their own. So we had to give people smartphones up, and we had to write the software that allowed us to be able to collect the data from those. And I just came across this the other day. You'll notice that we had an early version of Lo-Fi Girl as the icon on our app. Okay, so we're going to use these data in order to get this kind of thing. This is an illustration of the type of way in which so on the right is the interface that the participants would use in order to provide us data on a bunch of different questions. And this is constructed as a multiple timescale design in that people would come into the laboratory, they'd fill out some assessments, we would give them a phone, they would carry that phone for 3 weeks, 21 days, and they would fill out multiple times per day these questionnaires. Then they would bring the phone back, fill out some questionnaires, go away for 4.5 months, and then come back and repeat the process again to get a second burst and again to a third burst. And this study took about 1.5 years to implement at that time. And that was what forced the 4.5 month break between the bursts. Why 4.5 months? I had an end date on which I had to spend the money by, and I knew that I wanted 3 bursts of measurement in there. So that forced us to 4.5 months. And now I spend time trying to come up with good theoretical reasons why 4.5 months is the proper cadence on which we should be measuring developmental change. So in this case, data really drove what the logistics drove how it is that we were conceptualizing the change process, how we are articulating the change process. So we have to be transparent with that. Okay, 150 adults, 21-day bursts, about 56 days per person, and 6 social interactions today. So I've got about 425 observations per person now. I think this is still one of the richest sort of experience sampling data sets that exist so far. So now I've represented my 150 people along an age axis. So that's age on the bottom there. They go 18 to 90. And this is cross-sectional age, which is a decades timescale invoked by the between-person differences in the design. And I can zoom into one person here is a 49-year-old female with 2 kids. And over the course of the year in which she participated in our study, there were these 3 bursts of data. So now this is a monthly sort of timescale, and we can see depression scores during each of those months, along with the average level of happy and sad that she reported during those time periods. Within a given burst, it can zoom in and look at every single day. So there were end of day reports that were taken, so 21 days of data, and we can see how that's lining up with regard to some weekday, weekend differences there. And we can even zoom into a day and look at the report she provided within a day. So now we're at the hourly time scale, and we can see that sadness, she was doing quite well on mood, except towards about 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Conversation with a family member that made her very some recovery by the end of the day through an interaction with a friend, perhaps. And in our latest work, we can even zoom further, and we can look at one of those particular conversations and see how is it that the participant on the top here venting at the beginning of the conversation and then getting some support from the friend along the way as that works forward. So all the different timescales here from decades all the way down to minutes in a single study, as long as one collects the data from that time. So the technology has afforded us the possibility to be able to do this. So we've invoked now different processes of interest at the different timescales: aging processes, mental health processes, social calendar processes associated with the days of the week, and family processes depending upon how those interactions with family members and others proceed. So I'm going to give a zoom now from a developmental process occurring along this age span with an emotion process about emotion regulation that would be manifesting at the fast timescale. So I'm calling this emotion processes and developmental processes, EMO-DEVO. Not EVO-DEVO, but EMO-DEVO. Okay, so here's an idea. So here is an island. So this is a 2-dimensional affect space, positive affect and negative affect. And the hill is the distribution of where the data are. So kind of the people live inside of the hill. And we're going to make this dynamic. So now this is for the prototypical 19-year-old in our data. Actually, this is raw data. So this is the data from the 19-year-old. And I'm going to let this go over age here And you can see what's happening to this. There's a lot of stuff happening underneath there. It's not normally distributed like a good statistical model. And the size of the island is shrinking and staying up in that positive portion of high positive affect, low negative affect portion of the space. So let's do that again because it's like a replay video here. So you can see that the space is shrinking and the variability of the space is also shrinking. So in line with some developmental theories, that as we get older, we get better at emotion regulation and in selecting environments in which we will have positive experiences. When I'm in my 20s, I'm really interested in everything in the world, but when I get older, I'm trying to reduce down to the stuff which is emotionally meaningful to me, so I constrict that space up. So we needed multiple timescales of data in order to be able to articulate that type of question. So my hunch is now that most theories require some sort of zooming. That's what I'm trying to say. The methods now exist to do this. Can we articulate, should we require theories to invoke some aspect of this temporal zoom in there? Okay, so that was the zooms. Now we'll go to the tensions. You can feel the tension in the room building as we're already here. So these would be models like an activator and inhibitor model. And notice now that emotion there, we treated as sort of a one-dimensional thing. And now in each of these models, we've got 2 dimensions that are in there. Sometimes these are hidden and sometimes they're not. But one thing which I've been thinking about is like we got a bicep and a tricep in our arm, and that allows us a lot more possibilities for movement than if we only had one of those muscles. So many systems are built in order to have additional flexibility in them because they have this tension between 2 different opposing forces in there. Okay, so let's take, for example, self-regulation. And we've been interested in how and when is it that self-regulation develops, typically around age 3 or so for children. And in almost all of the theories about self-regulation, they invoke this notion of that there is engagement of an executive process in order to alter a prepotent response. So in our case, like the child wants to get angry or the child wants to have fear, but then there's an executive process that comes in and tries to regulate those actions. So we have an activator inhibitor type model. And at the neural level, of course, there are all kinds of manifestations of this similar type of process occurring. Okay, so in this particular one, this is a robotic spider that is sitting in the corner of the room. And the child comes in with their mother and sits down. And this is a novel object, which is interesting. We have curiosity folks here. So here he is being curious. And then the robot moves. And there's a fear response that gets invoked. The prepotent response has been invoked. And then there is a regulatory process going on how is it that the dyad in this case is manifesting executive processes in order to try to regulate that fear. And at some point, you'll see his face now, it's switched so that he forgot that he was crying, got interested again, and then goes back to crying, and forth like this a number of times. So it's certainly a dynamic process. It's not a static process at all, but there is this approach and avoidance that's simultaneously happening in this case. Okay, so how do we model that? We've been doing it in one case here as a coupled dynamic system using second-order differential equations. So these are pendulums that are swinging back and forth. And when we have 2 pendulums and then they are interacting with each other, so they are pulling each other in a variety of different ways as we go forward here. The concept is not that, like this is just a physical model that's a relatively simple model that would be learned in Physics 101, trying to apply that here to the psychological properties of what's happening in the room here. Okay, so that's the equations. Meant to be intimidating, but at the same time not intimidating because it's just a regression equation like all other regression equations. I've got an outcome variable and I've got a bunch of predictor variables. Yeah, I put it inside of a multi-level model and I've coupled the 2 of them together, but it's not that hard to run anymore. And particularly with Bayesian estimation, you can fit these relatively easily. You just have to be patient as it tries to find a solution to that particular piece. Okay, I'm happy to talk more about those details later. What do we find here? These kids came in at age 2 and then they came back again at age 5. So we have a longitudinal design here and we can see that age 2, when we fit that model, the parameters indicate to us that the activator is overwhelming the inhibitor. So the fear response gets invoked, and then the child is really sort of staying in the fear. There's a little bit of fluctuation, but the fear, it seems to manifest for a much longer period of time. And at age 5, then we see that the inhibitor is suppressing the activator relatively effectively and relatively quickly compared to at age 2. So this produces some empirical evidence about how the short-term regulation process has changed over the long-term developmental process. So the tension has switched over the long term. So it's zoom simultaneously with the tension piece here. Okay, so that's the tension piece. I had a reason for including this slide again. And the tension is, I can't remember right now, and there's a learning process and a forgetting process that are happening simultaneously. Okay, so into switches. And the switches is going to take us into the third part of the talk here. So this is event. And notice this from a data perspective, this is categorical time series data often is what we're engaged with here. And most of my early work had been with continuous data. So for me, it was new to try to get into categorical time series data streams and how is it that we treat those categorical time series. So this is the last part now, digital life and complexity, a small data approach to big data. So first I want to preface this with, my best friend is a tennis coach. And what you're going to see here is a tennis thing. But what Coach Phillips tells me is that in the pros, 75% of points are 4 or less shots. So serve, hit, 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 and then it's over. Serve, hit, then it's over. Like there's really short stuff which is happening in tennis. This is the longest tennis rally which exists, so because I need time to talk. So you'll see this going on and forth. And I want to concentrate on all the different things that are happening here. So 10 to 12 steps per shot. Notice that there's a lot of preparation that's happening. Decisions based upon looking at the person on the other side of the net and where it is that they're located and where it is that one is preparing to hit this ball for, so where one needs to travel to do that. So imagine how many actions are happening within short periods of time here. And it continues. So you serve something back, and then you have to prep again and get ready for the next thing to come back at us. I'm going to show you in a second smartphone use. A person doing a whole bunch of tiny little actions, serving up something to the algorithms or the environment, which then serves something back to them, which then they prepare and go forward like this. I'm going to try one out here. Is that we're encouraged to take 10,000 steps per day. How many steps is happening here within sport performance, which is good for development? How many steps are happening on the smartphone, which is apparently in some circles bad for development? I want to try to make a parallel here between the sport skill process and what's happening in smartphones. So here's the smartphone one now. There are some evocative images in here because this has been purposefully trying to change people's emotions and to capture something about what does the emotional space look like or the emotional dimension look like. I'll get back a little bit why it is that we did that. So these are screenshots taken every 5 seconds. We've had a variety of different studies in which we've done this. The latest one is 260 adults who did it for an entire year. So that's 365 days of media use. And they fill out questionnaires periodically, in our case, every 2 weeks in that process. Also, we have adolescents and their parents. Half of them, their parents also were involved. So we also got data from them as well. So 3.5 centuries of everyday life. And before I showed you a little hill that was morphing over time, and that was only 1 century long. So now we've got 3.5 centuries of this every 5 seconds data to play with here. Okay, and again, you see lots of different types of content here. We're particularly interested in the ways in which, because of 3.5 centuries of data, I can't look at it all. What are the ways that we can leverage computer models and or AI now, generative AI now, in order to be able to process these data faster than we could ever process them. But this is sort of the idea that we go here. Notice that the size of the image just changed, which was something that I didn't expect to happen in the data set when we were collecting it. And these little hurdles that we run into every once in a while, and then have to try to figure out ways to adopt our pipelines in order to be able to get back some of that information. Okay, you all use your smartphones for multiple hours per day. I think I'm about at 4 hours, and I'm sort of on the low end of that distribution. So you're all familiar with what it is that you just saw there. Okay, so what I want to try to do here is say that this is big data. And for that, we have data mining. And then we can also treat it as small data. And that I'm interested in person-specific models and how is it that we invoke person-specific thinking. So here's a quote from Deborah Estrin and colleagues. So the term big data expresses the potential of extracting meaning and value using data sets covering large numbers of people or a large N. Big data's humbler counterpart, small data, promises to be equally transformative, allowing individual users to harness the data they generate to their own use of online and mobile services, or in other terms, when N equals 1. So I'm trying to make a contrast here between the N equal many that is needed in order to be able to make some generalizations to populations versus the N equal 1, which is many, many time points, which might be needed in order to make generalizations across time. And to put these two sort of next to each other and see how it is that it proceeds if we apply the models in one way or the other, and in the other. Okay, so here's one person screenome. This is an adolescent. Each row is 1 day. It goes from midnight on the left to midnight on the right. And black periods is when the person is using the phone, and the white is when the phone is not on. This is during the school year. Hard to tell when it is that school is happening here, and also hard to tell when it is that the sleeping is happening as well. And this is not different from many of the other ones which we see as well. So there's lots of behavior which is happening here. And when we first got into this, the idea was that this is just going to be able to expand so that any part of life that you're interested in, any phenomena that you're interested in, will be represented in there somewhere. And more of it is moving in this direction, so we can get that kind of data. Okay, so now our job is to take this from a binary representation like this to something which is more colorful, and try to put features, to extract features out which are interest of us to us as for tracking out the behavior. Okay, so we can do this using low-level graphical features. So it can simply here calculate the color entropy. So this is how many different colors are represented, how many of the pixels of different colors are represented on the screen. You can see the screen on the right is mostly black, so it has a very low entropy score, whereas the screen on the left has a wider color representation, and so it has a higher entropy score. And so now we can take entropy of those images and create these long time series. So I got 1 year of time series of the entropy of all the images that were on your phone. And maybe that represents something about information complexity and the cognitive work that is happening on the perception of those images. Okay, we can also go to high-level graphical features. So now these are off-the-shelf models that have been trained on other sources like ImageNet and then applied to these data which are out of distribution, just to keep that in mind as we go forward here. So we can identify different types of objects that are in here. I'm interested in whether people are cat people or dog people. It is represented in the screenome, and you can see relatively quickly which category it is that this person fits in, although there is surprisingly more pet crossover than you would expect on first blush. And whereas interest in loneliness, particularly during the pandemic, how many people are we exposed to in our digital world, and can that serve as some proxy or way in which we could do interventions? Are people sort of using their digital exposures to other people in a way that is helpful for their mental health, or perhaps detrimental? We don't know that yet, but first we got to quantify how many people are actually in those pieces. Okay, we can also pull out faces, and here, like size of face, the gender of the face, etc. These are now, remember, these are off-the-shelf algorithms. They have biases embedded in them, so we have to be careful about how it is that we're making inferences from them, but there appears to be pulling out some signal here from all of the different pieces that we see. Okay, and then taking a couple of these different models here. So Perry and Vuong forwarded a model in which they pull out high-level representations from the pixel space, facial expression recognition, scene classification, and object classification, and then they use those in order to predict the affective valence and arousal of a given picture based upon a bunch of data sets where humans rated all of these pictures as well. And notice here the biological counterpart in that the idea is to go from the pixel representations up to an abstract representation, and then do the affect judgment from the abstract representation rather than from the pixels directly to the affect piece. And they found that this was more effective in doing that piece. Okay, so we can do that in ours. And here I just want to make another reminder is that this model was trained on images like those up on the top, in which there's often one object in focus in the center of the picture, whereas our data are quite out of distribution in that you have a wide variety of objects that are spread out across the screen and in different places. So it's questionable on whether this can actually be applied out of distribution well. So we did this study where we had people rate the original images, people rate screenshots, and then have the computer rate the screenshots as well and see how well all of this works. And I would say that from that, we learned that it is, from psychometric perspective, not great, but it appears as though there is some signal in there. So I'm comfortable, having spent a lot of money to get those data, on proceeding forward, because if I can grab some signal from there, then it is worth it to try to do this without having to retrain the model. Okay, and then we can pull out all of the text. So we know from psychological studies that the text that people write or expose themselves to has some implications for their psychological state. So for instance, the number of pronouns that exist in there. And this is actually quite a different prop. So notice that sometimes on these screens, the text is tilted and backwards. So this particular algorithm gets the tilted text correct, but it doesn't get the backwards text correct. And it's also a little bit difficult vision problem because the backgrounds are constantly changing here. So it's not like reading a PDF document, which we might consider to be a solved problem, but there are some pieces here that are still that we still have some trouble with, but the latest algorithm seem to be doing pretty good. Okay, so we can also get words out, and the word velocity, also a measure of cognitive complexity, all of the inferences that we can try to make there as well. Okay, so now I can get a labeled screenome of all these different types. We have 1,000 different dimensions now that we can look at here. And now the question is, what can we do with those? That becomes the interesting question now. So here's looking at the screenome. This is a 24-hour period for one person. And notice that this person is on their screen for about 22 hours out of the day. And one wonders, who are these people who phones for 22 hours of the day? And these are professional survey takers. So there is a subset of our sample who is recruited through a firm like Qualtrics, and they are very good at using their phones in order to be able to do work tasks like watch ads for money and give their ratings of those. So that is why you see this particular person that represented so much screen time. I chose this one because visually it's beautiful. It doesn't have big gaps in it, so the eye representation becomes clear. But just to note that we're not always sure who it is that we're studying and what the generalization to the population might be. But I'm a time guy. I'm more interested in the small n. Who is this one person and how is it that they generalize over time? So I'm using this as a contrast case also to highlight the other possibility up here. Okay, so let's go. How do we do this? We're funded actually to do food related content in the Screenome and see how it is that the food which you're exposed to in your digital life actually manifests in the consumption of food in real life. There was probably a text or an email which you got which indicated there would be pizza at this event. And so there is a representation in the digital world of what it is that is happening here in the real world. Okay, so how do we do this? We do dictionary lookup of all the words that are there to try to find those. the identification of food in pictures is quite a difficult problem that we're having some trouble with in solving. But in our ethnographic analyses of these, one thing which we can learn from this from a media perspective is notice that the drinks, pictures of drinks, which are often represented on smartphone screens, have branding in them. Pictures of food items most often do not have branding in them. So one practical thing which we've learned so far might be that if you're creating food for people to brand it somehow visually so that your brand can manifest in these pictures and travel further. Okay, just to give one person here plays a game which is called World Chef. So 38% of the content which is on their phone is food-related content. And one question would be, are the words which surround that food content more positive than negative? Because if they're more positive, then implicitly there would be a pairing between the positive words and the food content. And in this case, that's true, that the food content is slightly more positive than the non-food content in this case. Okay, another one is got a student, Michelle Eng, who's working on climate change and extreme weather events. Collecting data during the Texas winter storm that sort of shut off power and ended up shutting off water for a number of days. So we can check to see how is it that the risk communications are manifesting on people's smartphone devices. Many of the theories about risk communication were developed in a time where radio and TV were the primary modes in which communication about events was being transferred to the public. Now there's a wider variety of ways in which that's happening. So to just give a couple of examples here on those, and in our qualitative analysis of those, we can see that perhaps beyond just risk and efficacy, that we're also seeing lots of social support, sense making, and humor as new ways in which the content surrounding extreme events is being transferred from person to person. So in a way, being able to get the microscope and see what people are actually watching of all of this news which is being produced is leading us to new conclusions or perhaps revisions of some of the theory that's guiding how that content is being created. Okay, similar space is sustainability. Is typically for our devices the way in which we measure the sort of climate costs of those devices is about the manufacturing process of the device, and perhaps a little bit about how much energy that device uses when you plug it into the wall, or that the network, the big data networks use when you're connecting to those networks, that also takes some energy there. One thing that the Screenome allows us to do is to be able to look at the actual behaviors that people engage in that are facilitated by those devices as well. So when I call an Uber, there is a energy cost which is associated with the Uber, perhaps some of which should be attributed to me as an individual. So this gives us a way in which we can see those behaviors, and you notice these great big pieces of red bubbles here that are over the course of this 24 hours, the costs associated with the actions that a person is taking on the device rather than from the device itself. And this paper sort of develops a methodology for how to make those computations. Okay, the within-person designs allow us to do also natural experiments. So looking at particular types of content and what are the responses to those types of content. So here's payday loan ads, which are illegal. And I'll just sort of zoom in to one person here. The red is when they were exposed to payday loan ads. And we can zoom into one particular piece, the 5 minutes before exposure to the ad and the 5 minutes after the exposure to the ad. The number of future-oriented words as a proxy for future orientation is diminished after exposure to the ad. So there is a consequence of the ad in the moment that we think we can try to get a handle on now as well. So very fast timescale process, a rare event. So you have to track continuously in order to get that event, but then you can engage in the experiment as well. Okay, we can do clustering of these to try to pull out particular kinds. So far from that, we've learned about the visual interfaces that people are often using. Stacks often are an important part of that. And there's an active learning component. It's how do you actually train it to get the right classifications and sort of bringing the human into the loop of those classifications in order to label some edge cases in order that we can get the clustering to do a little bit better. And where that has led us to is to transformer models, the latest set of large language models, and to these multimodal embedding spaces. So now, rather than working with the 10,000 pixels that are in a given screenshot, and feed those into the transformer and then translate those into a location in a high dimensional space. So here's the clip model, which is trained on images and captions. So it's a representation of both text and visual features simultaneously. That's a 768 dimensional space. So now I can locate each screenshot in that space, and I can try to check what the trajectories are of people moving around in that space. So when a person is higher anxiety, do they move around in a different way through different kinds of content than when they're in a lower anxiety state? Depression, we're seeing some contraction of the space as well. And now run into a real difficulty is that, as you can tell from the slides, I'm relatively visually oriented here, and the 768 dimension visual representation I can't do. So this is a two-dimensional projection of that. And I also don't even know how to interpret these dimensions when we get out that they're related to something. So I'm sort of really struggling now in this space on how is it that we deal with interpretability of the mathematical representations, which are elegant and very interesting. And that has been a real challenge there. So even in this one, you see little clusters that are in there. And I can say from going in and looking at these clusters that some of them are real things. So very concrete, that there happens to be a red icon in the upper left-hand corner. And other ones of them at the same level of the clustering are abstract concepts like violence. And being able to then try to do interpretation of the clusters that we get out, where it's a mix of both very concrete things and very abstract concepts, that I don't quite know how to deal with them yet either. So I'm excited to talk to you all about those kinds of things. So this is the dream, is to get that representation now moving in the 768 dimensional space. How is it that people are moving around? In order that we can see how is it that the introduction of this kind of media has changed the way we orient to space. Okay, sorry, I'm going to skip. When we go into each one of these, we get a representation of where a person picks up their smartphone, then they might end up doing a particular behavior. So if I enter into my smartphone here at this particular behavioral location, that I'm likely to end up gaming with my friends. Whereas if I pick my phone up with this intention, or that's the first behavior that I do, I end up doing a social media check-in. And the idea here is that there are these sort of islands of behavior. Some of them we might be more efficient than others. How can we build bridges, or in this case, train stops, that allow people to transfer from the express train onto the other train that they want? So for me, like if I get into TikTok, that's like an hour before I can get off that train and go into another train. So how can we build a station that's a little hop stop that I can actually get off that track earlier, would be the way in which we do this. Okay, so there's a network representation. Each person is completely different in their network representation. So we need to build a different set of train stops for each one of these people, which leads us to person-specific interventions. And now that we have the data to do that, perhaps we can do that at scale without having to do that. So I think scalability is possible. Obtain the data, person-specific data, lots of time points, do the person-specific analysis. And for that, we can then discover a person-specific theory and optimize the personal intervention just for that particular person. So we've talked about change processes. I introduced you to Zoots, thinking that perhaps all theories should have some qualification about zooms, tensions, and switches, and introduce you to the digital way in which we're looking at digital life and its complexity. Thank you very much. please.
Amazing work, as always. I'm just thinking about the point you made at the end of the dream of intervention for good. And one thing I struggle with when I'm thinking about the social media is bad, especially when you zoom into these timescales, and there's just so much happening that the question for me is how are you figuring out what's good? Is the fall into TikTok for an hour necessarily bad? For example, and what ways are you identifying which piece of this kind of travel through this huge space might be associated with outcomes that the person cares? Especially since right now it's the phone that's kind of doing the talking. And so I'm curious how you're thinking about linking that up with their self-reported clinician-based kind of measurement, doing that.
Yep. So good, interesting question that we've struggled with a lot, and I'm happy to hear. So I've tried to tee this up with a tennis example about people spending hours playing tennis and doing lots of action in between that, and that up against the smartphone. So that seems to have, from my perspective, that helped here in trying to create this question for you. And we have some subsets of our sample that are filling out these questionnaires. We have a 2-week cadence on some of it. We have experience sampling on others, so we can try to get at those sort of, as you sort of blunt measures of what is happening in the mental health or on the well-being side. And from that, we could then mine out from the data what is it that's related to when on weeks when I have better lower anxiety, that I engage in what types of behaviors during those weeks compared to the other weeks. And so then it gets defined per a particular person rather than for in general, what are the types of behaviors that they're engaged in on there. Now that this 2-week cadence is way too slow for the processes that are actually happening on that screen. So my other struggle is how do I pull out markers of what is good and bad from the screenome itself simultaneously with the cadence on which I'm getting the stimulus. Not to mention that also that stimulus is mixed between what the person is producing and what the environment is producing as well. So we've thought about this problem a lot and saying, how is it that we formulate the questions in order to be able to extract out those two pieces? And it's really challenged my notion of which is the person and which is the context. But that seems to be intermixed in both of these. I think in an ideal world, I would like to give people their data, have them tag it, have them let us know when it was good things and bad things, and then they can try to optimize back towards what it is that they would like to achieve in there, rather than us prescribing for them which is the good and which is the bad. Yep.
Data from a phone better for your purposes than, for example, data from a head-mounted camera with a speech sampling? I mean, in a way, maybe the phone is better because to some degree you're choosing what comes up on your phone, sort of. Maybe more than you're choosing what environment you're in, but then your environment is your real environment. So I don't know, what are your thoughts about doing the same kind of study, but with a camera that shows the world instead of showing your phone?
Yeah, so great. All these modalities are data, which becomes interesting. There's interesting data problems with them, and so we have a group at Stanford that is actually mounting cameras on young children's heads in order to see how it is that they're negotiating to their environment, how are they being curious about that and learning which things are they gravitating towards, et cetera, and using those data in order to train generative models that would be able to behave as the child behaves and perhaps even then figure out how to learn as a child learns, so that they can be trained off of that real world experience rather than by putting billions and billions of data into them. We went this route because my colleagues and I were interested in the media itself. One set of colleagues was interested in the media itself. What is the smartphone? How is it changing society, et cetera? And I had experience with doing smartphone-based research before, so that was a natural place for our meeting of the different disciplines together into that particular device. But I would like to get all of the physiological signals as well as the video from the outside, and certainly all the sensors that are in the world now. This data set is expanding and expanding, or the possibilities are expanding. I think we've probably got fascinated by the method, by the data collection aspect at this point, and haven't tried to pit it against other data sources to see which one would be better. We're trying to figure out how to formulate questions now that we have this kind of data. But the grand scheme, I think, is that we get all of the data and use that in order to be able to learn how it is that people are negotiating the world.
This was really interesting. And this figure kind of is an analogous problem to what we're having in education, where we're trying to figure out how kids move through math. And it's been a problem, but I wonder if it's almost a potential solution, or maybe a bit of a help. I'm assuming for especially social media, you have to contend with the fact that algorithms create a certain path dependency in people's behavior. We have the same problem where kids who are good at math move through the math landscape much faster and don't reach certain spaces. The same for kids who struggle with math. So I'm curious if you've thought about how that might inform your modeling strategy and how to basically collapse some of these dimensions for certain people, because maybe I'm never on TikTok in the same way that I did well in math, so I didn't go into remediation. So certain spaces are collapsed at the individual.
Yeah, maybe I get stuck in TikTok because I know I'm not as good at math as you are, so that might be one of the reasons. So we actually have one project which a postdoc is working on, which is about trying to separate out what we're calling heavy algorithmic spaces and light algorithmic spaces. And that sometimes I would like that the algorithm is keying up lots of content for me, and I don't have to do a whole lot of work for that to happen. And other times I want to be an agent who is directing where it is that I go through the space. And so far, what we're trying to do there is how do we divide this world up into that? That's a hard problem in and of itself, because many algorithms are mixed. So even if I say texting is one which is, I feel like I'm the agent, I'm the one who's texting, it gives me suggestions for what the next word should be or how I should spell that word. So there is an algorithm that is also in that sort of real fast version. But we think that there is a cognitive engagement cadence in how much effort it is that I would like to put into being an agent before I get served up something else. And here it would be nice to also have some off phone behavior in part, so that then we can know when are people turning to the phone to watch cat videos to regulate as something that's getting teed up to me. So I think that's how I would start to look at that. Thanks. But you made me think that perhaps there's a measurement aspect that we can use, because say in Math Garden that the items and the people are moving up and down simultaneously in the space. Is there a way in which we could use that sort of ELO chess rating version in order to be able to say which things are at my current ability level right now? Yep.
How are you thinking about leveraging like data science design conventions? For example, if I'm moving trajectory mental space that is, and I want to convention to push my mental trajectory in a different direction. How are you thinking about design and intervention that for how I like?
Yeah, great question. Because we just came out of some conversations that we have software which is collecting the data, and we just rewrote that in a way so that it's more modular, so that we can add other modules in more easily into that software. And one of them is what is the intervention model which we want to put in there. And the one I'm currently intrigued by, because it's relatively easy to implement, and we think it has some psychological value in what you're saying, is changing the screen from a color screen to a grayscale screen. So suddenly the media becomes much less engaging. And this is say Google has an intervention which is like that, and Apple also. I can do this on my iPhone in order to do this as well. So we can invoke it relatively quickly, but in a sense that is immediately shrinking the space So it's a very heavy intervention that shrinks the potential of the media space makes that much simpler, so that then that should change people's trajectory. So it's kind of like bringing a sledgehammer in order to be able to see, can we actually do this? And so that's the first place, which I think we're going to try to go, is that really blunt one. But going further, it would be, how can I send a text message or some sort of notification at the time when it's sort of been too long? We've seen you go down this kind of rabbit hole before, and then it takes you a while to come back out of that. So maybe providing information that says, well, the last time you did something like this, it was an hour. Are you sure that you would like to? So creating a little bit of friction into the system in order to be able to help people self-redirect there. We've also talked about like a potential intervention that you can get browsers now that you can say replace particular words in the browsers or remove the ads, for instance. So all of those would be potential options as well to try to redirect people. Thanks.
I'm thinking about the fact that phones are so good at getting us hooked, and that we've evolved to traps of just being on. And I'm wondering how much academia is catching up with industries whose job it is to put on our phones. So in your talk, you talked about like taking off-the-shelf algorithms, and so I'm curious if they're coming from industry or if they're off-the-shelf algorithms that have been academia. And also whether you've had conversations with folks who are in the business of making people stay on their phones and thinking about how the methods that you're doing might be helped by theories and methods that they have been using forever to kind of push and pull people.
Yeah, great question. That I think that it would be better if we could have more conversations about the nitty-gritty between what are our industry partners doing at the sort of ground level in order to provoke engagement, so that we don't have to sort of try to back engineer what some of those algorithms are doing. There's a lot of theory about the types. So we just did the example of a color scheme is a form to keep engagement versus the black and white screen is to keep engagement. So there's some small stuff like that that we already know how that's working. And reinforcement schedules are also a way in which we can try to use our academic knowledge that is being applied in industry in order to do that. I find that many of the algorithms seem to be, from my personal exposure to them, working still in a much more between person type of space than in the within person type of space. There is some sort of dynamic things which are happening. So TikTok, it might be one of the better examples that it's very fast to change content based upon what my behavior is doing. And so I think that that's probably moving in this direction too. So learning from industry on what the actuality of those algorithms are would be quite helpful. And I think that when I talk to people who are sitting in the big data houses, like we all have a common goal, which is to help create people's well-being and to have people's well-being, however that's defined, and for which parties might be weighted more or less. But I don't think that we're all totally at odds with each other. So I think that just the transparency of the conversations and figuring out what works would be helpful.
Like this is an important health behavior that can actually extract from the data. So I'm interested to look at what predicts good sleep.
It seems like we would be able to extract that from our data, but it actually gets to be quite hard from trying to figure out how we define sleep. So there's some algorithms about how do I identify the last before bedtime usage and the piece when because I don't actually have sensors on them on when it is that they're sleeping. So that turned out to be much harder than we thought, because the phone itself wakes up multiple times, even if the person doesn't wake up multiple times during the night. So yeah, so it's become hard to differentiate those pieces in the data. think we have one sort of preliminary result is about the variability in the media space related to the variability in sleep. So we have self-reports of the what was the how varying was your bedtime over the course of the last 2 weeks, and that seems to also manifest with how much of the space they're moving around in the space there as well. So that's just preliminary. I wouldn't put too much in that yet, but that's one way in which we've been trying to look at that. Thank you.